Hello, my name is Laura Warner, and welcome to my Best Evidence Showcase. I'm so glad you could join me here this afternoon as I process and reflect on my last 12 weeks student teaching in a third grade classroom at an international Christian school, and just share some of my teaching philosophies, especially with Christian education and learning philosophy. So let me begin with these words. As a consequence of the fall, fragmentation occurred in all aspects and levels of life, becoming more and more prominent as humans went further astray from God. Let me read that one more time. It says, as a consequence of the fall, fragmentation occurred in all aspects and levels of life, becoming more and more prominent as humans went further astray from God. These are the opening words to Dr. Priscilla Popp's article in an educational journal about the theological basis for biblical integration. And she goes on to mention all the different ways that humans attempt to sever themselves from God. She talks about church and state, religion and science, thought and deed, all the ways that we attempt to separate ourselves and create categories. Really, the basis of public school education is based on the idea that you can tease out all the unnecessary or questionable parts of learning, and really they mean faith by that, things that cannot be scientifically proven. The idea is you can tease that out to create a neutral education. But we know, as Christian educators, there really is no such thing as a completely neutral education. The philosophy of the teacher is either leaning in toward Christ or away from Christ. Whether you're speaking in a Christian school or not, who you are as a teacher affects how you teach. So really what Priscilla Popp is looking for is a sense of unity. So what the basis of my Christian education philosophy is biblical integration. And that doesn't mean that you are inserting Christ into the curriculum you already have. You're not just tacking a Bible verse onto it or just saying a prayer at the beginning of the day and teaching the way you always would teach. It's really about concepts and questioning and curiosity, especially in science, inspiring awe in students. And what do we know to be true about God? Proverbs tells us that God is the beginning of all knowledge. And that also doesn't mean that everything we need to know in the world is literally in the Bible. That's clearly not true, but the concepts are there, who Christ is as the Word. And I always thought that was awfully interesting, how besides his literal presence in human form as Christ, or in spirit, God chose the written word, language, to communicate with us. So I think that's incredibly important with how we first start in the beginning was the Word, and that's where education comes from. And 3 questions you can ask yourself to approach any topic. It's called the 3C model with biblical integration, is to ask, how does this correlate with God's Word? Especially when you're reading poetry or reading a novel that might have themes that you're not sure if they're biblical. Do they belong in a Christian classroom? I think if you use it appropriately, absolutely. So how does this correlate with God's Word? How does it conflict? And what do I need to continue to study? So that model is an excellent way to show how can you take any topic in the classroom and show how is Christ involved in this. And that brings me into more my philosophy of learning and truly learners, because learning should be student-centered in your education. And we know that every single child, every single person bears the image of God. And what that means is that they have value and they reflect God in our relationships and the way God is a Trinity. So learning should be relational and done in community. I had a professor who always said the fastest way to become a heretic is to only study the Bible by yourself. And I think that's true of all learning. When you only study by yourself, you're not checked, you're not learning from each other. That gives you a real tunnel vision that I don't think is the vision that God has for learning and community. And something that I found was really interesting in a more secular context, a U.S. president a couple of years ago said in a State of the Union address, I believe, that his vision for education was that every child be a global competitor in the working field. And I think that's an excellent goal. We want quality education, but I don't think that quite shoots high enough. I don't think our measuring of learning is just on success in the job field, but it goes even beyond that with who they are and pursuing the knowledge of who is God and who am I in light of that. And no matter what a student is capable of doing, which they are capable of so much, that includes anyone with a disability, all cognitive differences, everybody is able to have a full learning experience, no matter if they're able to measure up to the success that we have labeled for ourselves in the secular world. So we take that and go even further, that it's the value of the individual, and they're valuable now as learners, and not just when they're adults being successful, making money for other people is what it really comes down to often. So in reflecting on the last 12 weeks, I had the InTASC principles, which stands for the Interstate New Teachers Assessment and Support Consortium. So basically what this is just a process of 10 standards that helps teachers see and track where they've grown and developed, and it's separated into 4 fields, which is the learner in learning, content knowledge, instructional practice, and professional responsibility. So if a teacher is thriving, or at least pursuing those 4 fields, they will be a successful professional teacher. So I had a rubric that has all 10 standards right here that helped me track my process as I went along. So I'll just share some evidence. How have I grown? How have I perhaps even shown some of these standards? So the first one has to do with learner development. And it says the teacher understands how learners grow and develop, recognizing that patterns of learning and develop very individually within and across the cognitive, linguistic, social, emotional, and physical areas, and designs and implements developmentally appropriate and challenging learning experiences. So what do you know about that student, and what are you going to do about it? Is a way to summarize that. So an example I had of this, of how they grow and develop and build concepts, we did a lesson in writing on sentence fluency, and I knew that having multiple ways of hearing the information would help the students. So I started just with this picture of a river flowing, and I had them take some time. What did they notice about the picture? What would it be like to be at that place? And they discussed it with each other, and then shared whole class. And we got words like flowing and gentle and smooth and interesting, because it was turning like that. And we slowly began to build that concept, and I asked, really, what would that look like if your paragraphs looked like that? Because especially I had noticed with my cooperating teacher that a lot of their paragraphs had very simple sentences, all the same length. They were getting to a point where it was grammatically correct, just not as fluent as we would like it to be. So we built that concept and then named it sentence fluency. So they had the idea and then a definition. And then from there, I was able to give them specific examples of what they can look for to change. So description, different sentence beginnings, different sentence lengths, transition words and conjunctions. And I thought building that concept was a lot more helpful than just giving this list and then saying, go run with this. So this is something we keep on our classroom wall on the back, and I've seen them even use it when they're asked, how can I make this paragraph better? And I say, well, what do we know about sentence fluency? So they can use that as a resource right there. And then my second, learning differences. So the teacher uses understanding of individual differences in diverse cultures and communities to ensure inclusive learning environments that enable each learner to meet high standards. So this one seemed an obvious choice for this class. I have 17 students. We had 19 at the beginning, and from many different countries, and half of them come from African countries. And I realized in our Bible curriculum, which I've loved incorporating, a lot of the faces look much more Caucasian. and maybe they're gently Middle Eastern looking, maybe, but that just doesn't quite connect with them in the same way. And so I used this painting, which was hard to find. I had to search for a lot, of Sarah's laughter, showing an African woman, and first, just all of their faces, just gasping, what, Sarah's black? And a lot of them started chanting that. And so it clearly resonated with them and connected with where they were at. And it started a great conversation on what is contextualization within Scripture, which is something I didn't learn about till college, but I explained that the Bible is relevant to each of them and each of their cultures, and people tend to paint scriptural images the way they perceive themselves. And so seeing a picture of someone faithfully laughing in joy at God's faithfulness was something, as a new image I could add to their mental vocabulary of something that they could participate in. So this was just to show that the Bible matters to them too, by having those other images as well. And then learning environments. The teacher works with others to create environments that support individual and collaborative learning, and that encourage positive social interaction, active engagement in learning, and self-motivation. So I used one hands-on activity. So in this activity, I have a poster up here, and the question we were posing for that lesson is, what can I find in the dictionary? And I modeled, how do I look up the words? Why would I do that? And I had them in partners. They each had a piece of paper and a word they could look up. And I picked the partners beforehand and did vary the level of difficulty of the words depending on who was in the group to challenge them where they were at, just for that differentiation. But then they could also work together and figure out, what are we looking for? What's a guide word? And so they could record all that information, and then they use this as a resource by our library over there. And then we also did a similar activity with the thesaurus, and that really resonated with them because they were able to use that with their word choice that we were also learning in writing. So now they had a new skill that they could use practically, and they were excited about making their writing better. So that's two skills working together in a way that they could do it themselves, and not just ask the teacher, how do you spell this? How do you do this? What's another word? As they had a resource to do it themselves. Our fourth standard is content knowledge, which is the teacher understands the central concepts, tools of inquiry, and structures of the discipline she teaches, and creates learning experiences that make those aspects of the discipline accessible and meaningful for learners to assure mastery of content. So here I have a poster that we did in science, and the essential question you were asking for that lesson or group of lessons was, how do seasons affect living things? And so we were able to use a flipped classroom approach to have them read the content at home. The curriculum was a little younger for their age groups. That way they could easily grasp that information. And then in class, we're able to extend that knowledge. And so first, they just learned how do seasons affect living things, and learn general information. What is migration? What is adaptation? What are ways that plants change, and even humans? But then I was able to give them research projects to do with Chromebooks, and they're able to produce a poster. So I just gave each of them an animal and said, find out how does this specific animal change throughout the season. So it's going beyond the broad question to a more specific one. And then this group on frogs, they were able to discover that frogs, different species, some migrate and some hibernate, and compare and contrast to those things. And then also another group did bears, which hibernate, to compare and contrast how do bears and frogs hibernate differently. And so they're able to extend that knowledge and also just find information they were personally interested in to support that. And it's hard to see in this picture, but they did start labeling these pictures of the frogs, And so that way they're also pulling in what they know about text features and integrating those ELA skills with their science skills. And then number 5 is application of content. So in this standard, the teacher understands how to connect concepts and use differing perspectives to engage learners in critical thinking, creativity, and collaborative problem solving related to authentic local and global issues. So we've already done a project and a few lessons on the water cycle, using mirrors and words just to remember that process and that vocabulary. And so we also did a research extension on that. So just beyond what is the water cycle, what are issues that pertain to the water cycle. So here I have a picture of a Google slide they were able to create. And in the first section it says, what is water conservation? Why is it important? So moving on just from the basic science, what is the water cycle, to a global issue that is a challenge today. And then the second is, how can you help conserve water? So that goes into the personal application. This matters to you, a third grader. How can you personally conserve water? So able to research and compile that information on a Google slide, and then also just learn skills, how to use bullet points and things like that with creating a Google slide. Our 6th one, the teacher understands and uses multiple methods of assessment to engage learners in their own growth, to monitor learner progress, and to guide the teachers in learning's decision making. So this one is especially with guiding decision making. So one way beyond just the typical test or quiz was to do something online. And here I have a picture of a quizzes they did for a figurative language unit. And I had them take this quizzes multiple times throughout the week, so I could see what do they know, what do we need to continue to study. Also right here I have a graph for these questions. I can see, all right, this is the most missed question. This is the one that we really know well and probably don't need to review as much. And so this one they take all together, and I would use that information to plan future instruction. For Bible, I often use a Kahoot, which in that case you get immediately, everyone answers the question, and then you can see, all right, so let's revisit this, and we can reteach right in that moment and use it as a reteaching tool as you go. So that's a great formative way to assess, and you can use it summatively as well. And then also a more non-traditional one is to use a rubric. So this one was adapted specifically for posters and oral presentations, and it helps them have a guiding point of what needs to be in their presentation. We use this for the one on seasonal changes, and it's things like content, the quality of information, and then just the visual design and helping them recognize that all of these pieces are important. If you're a brilliant scientist but can't tell anyone about what you learned, that's not very helpful. So getting that integrated approaches together. And then also on the end, they can self-assess to help just improve their self-awareness and their growth, and so they know where they're at. They're not just receiving a letter and wondering, I have no idea why I got that. It's very specific, and then also the teacher assesses them. 7 is planning for instruction. So the teacher plans instruction that supports every student in meeting rigorous learning goals by drawing upon knowledge of content areas, curriculum, cross-disciplinary skills, and pedagogy, as well as knowledge of learners in the community context. So just a general pedagogical practice is modeling math concepts with counters. And this is another way you can build a concept. Here's a picture of using counters for division before naming that and using the equation. So just having the physical reminder of what are we doing. These aren't just numbers in our head, is there's actually a process to be learned there. And so that's just a common pedagogical practice of using physical examples. And then another one, So one that's more cross-disciplinary is learning and music. We would have hymns we'd learn in our Bible curriculum, and we would take in what were our ELA skills. I'd ask, what can we learn from this hymn? And then after a while I started saying, what's the theme of this hymn? And then it all flipped together. And I'm like, wait a second, we know what that is. So what was the theme of Mighty Fortress is Our God? How can we learn that together? And then also, learning personally and personal application, we know spiritually, I can ask, how does this make you feel? What can you learn about God from this? And I can see the more hymns we used, the more we practice those skills, because it is practicing identifying how you feel. I could see that spiritual growth of being more sensitive. Often, as time went on, they were better able to recognize, I feel sad and happy at the same time. And at first it was much more confusing, and after a while it made more sense to them of those dual truths and just that complicated way that we perceive scripture and can internalize that. In a spiritual level, they weren't always completely able to identify, but just learning what are some words we can use to describe those experiences. And then standard 8, we have instructional strategies. So the teacher understands and uses a variety of instructional strategies to encourage learners to develop deep understanding of content areas and their connections, and to build skills to apply knowledge in meaningful ways. How can we make this meaningful and build skills? Here we have another example of doing something very physical and visual. So again, in science class, we had them use cotton balls to display, glued onto a blue piece of paper, and show what are the different types of clouds. And so meeting each student where they're at, because it is such an international setting, having so many ELL students, English language learners, some would label their clouds, and then that showed exactly what they learned. Some would write a sentence to extend that a little bit, and then our more advanced students who just had better grasp on the English language were able to research and write a 3 to 4 sentence paragraph for each type of cloud. So they were each being challenged with what the abilities they had in that varied approach. Standard number 9 is the teacher engages in ongoing professional learning and uses evidence to continually evaluate her practice, particularly the effects of her choices and actions on others. So the learners, families, other professionals, and community, and adapts practice to meet the needs of each learner. So a lot of that is outside the classroom, and that really is through professional relationships. So mentor teachers saying, have an idea, does this work at all? And just being able to bounce that off somebody. Often it's this thing, but let's think of something else for this, or this is something I've done before, and just getting experience from master teachers. I think experience is one of the best teachers itself, so yeah, learn from each other that way. And then just participating in the professional development opportunities at a school, action research, for instance, or whatever variant you might find on that. And learning from other teachers that you may have never interacted with, and having specific goals in mind of, we want to practice and see what does this website look like in our classroom, and so that way we can just cover more ground if we all have areas of expertise to come and teach to each other. Our final one is leadership and collaboration. So this standard says the teacher seeks appropriate leadership roles and opportunities to take responsibility for student learning, to collaborate with learners, families, colleagues, other school professionals, and community members to ensure learner growth and to advance the profession. So one example I have of that is just communication with families, doing it regularly. Here I have a picture of a weekly newsletter to encourage involvement in learning. So each week the parents will receive on Mondays for each subject, what are we learning that week? How can I help my child? Simple definitions, perhaps you're learning about figurative language. So what is a hyperbole? So that way they can be actively involved. with students especially who are struggling in math, practicing at home is going to be one of the biggest ways that help them. So that sort of practice, and then just involving the community in the school setting, having announcements for events you might be having, and just keeping the whole family involved. Because really in education, it's a partnership with the parents. We're not exclusively the ones educating these kids. It's a team effort. So keeping them involved in that way. So those are the 10 standards. And then the final component of this presentation is just how do I personally think I've grown. And I think it's a little ironic, but I would say it's growth mindset. That is a huge theme in this 3rd grade classroom. This graphic compares growth mindset with a fixed mindset. This one has quotes like, failure is an opportunity to grow versus failure is my limit, or I can't do it yet, or I can't do it. And I think it's funny because I spend my time teaching others, and I think it's easy to forget I also have a lot to learn. And what I really connected it with was spiritual growth, and thinking about the concept of each Christian being a saint. And I think a lot of us joke around of, oh, I lost my sanctification. I say things like that all the time of I'm just not where I'm supposed to be. I can't do this. I'm just a sinner. I'm going to leave it at that, and really forgetting the reality of who Christ has made us to be, and our state, if we are one with Christ, is to be a saint in who he is. And I see that reflected integratively in education in the same way. He's made us to be learners and to be relational, and there's so much to grow, and I think I've learned the most in having self-compassion, and that simply translates into compassion for other people. But it makes me question, if you say you have compassion for others but not for yourself, what sort of compassion do you really have for others? So I think that's one of the biggest ways I've grown spiritually this semester, and I've been very glad to be at the International Christian School of Vienna, and thank you for listening.